What's up, y'all? Alvin here, and in this video I'm going to help all you trout guys and gals catch more bass on the fly. And I'll probably help you bass guys and gals catch more bass on the fly. Just watch the video.
I tell the good jokes.
All right, so who am I? Well, I've been a full-time fly fishing guide since 2004, and during that time I spent a decade as a trout guide in the Rockies, and the rest of the time I've been fly fishing for bass and redfish in Texas. So I know a little bit about a couple different types of fly fishing. All right, so 5 basic tips to help you trout anglers catch more bass on the fly. Number 1, tackle. If you're just getting started, there's no need to go out and buy a whole bunch of new gear. You can start bass fishing with your trout rod. Unless it's like a 2-weight or a 1-weight, you're probably gonna be able to catch bass on it. Now, if you've got a 5-weight, you're probably fine. A couple things you probably wanna do. Definitely number 1 is get some shorter, heavier leaders. You know, you can just take your trout leaders and cut them down. So you really don't need anything lighter than 3X for bass fishing. And I personally, most of my bass are caught on something between, I'd say 12 and 20 pound tests for the tippet, just to give you an idea. But like I said, you can cut your trout leaders back. You can buy leaders specifically for bass, and that's an easy way to do it. The other thing is, you can fish with your trout taper fly line, but if you wanted to make an investment and get a little bit heavier fly line, that wouldn't hurt either, because you're typically not going to be making as long a cast. So there are some half weight, so maybe like a 5.5 weight or even a 6 weight, just depending, because a 6 weight is going to load your 5 weight up a lot faster for the short casts that we typically make for bass, and also it's going to allow you to throw a slightly larger fly. But the thing is you don't have to go out and buy all new gear to start bass fishing. Just start bass fishing with what you got. Okay, so second thing, flies. Now, you've probably got some flies that will work in your trout box. So think buggers, streamers, that type of stuff. Maybe even some of your large dry flies. If you have big hoppers, a lot of the big hoppers, especially stuff like Chernobyl ants, those are perfect bass flies, especially for smaller like stream bass. My favorite hill country small stream bass fly is going to be a Chernobyl ant, and I'm probably going to be throwing it on a 4 or a 5 weight. So if you find yourself in that type of situation bass fishing, then yeah, get some stuff out of your bass box. Now, if you're going to get some stuff out of your trout box. Now, if you're going to get some flies specifically for bass fishing, you're obviously going to probably want to size them up, so some bigger poppers or some bigger hoppers or some larger streamers. Bass, even small bass, will eat some surprisingly large flies. So really the only limitation initially is just how big of a fly can you throw on your trout rod. If you've got a 6-weight trout rod, I think you're golden. But that's just something to think about when you're kind of transitioning from trout fishing to bass fishing as far as flies go. All right, number 3 is casting. Now, one of the main things with casting for trout is trying to get a good, delicate presentation so that you don't spook the trout. It's almost the opposite thing when you're bass fishing. A lot of times a splashy presentation, a big frog or a popper or something, or a hopper making a big splat when it hits the water will actually attract the bass to your fly. So we're not so concerned about a delicate presentation, and that's good because, like I said earlier, we're going to be using some heavier leaders, shorter leaders, which tend to make your flies splash down more anyway. The thing that is super important with fly fishing for bass that's not quite as important when you're fly fishing for trout is the accuracy of your presentation. So with bass fishing, a lot of times you're having to land really close to a target, a rock or log or the bank. A lot of times bass will hunker down underneath overhanging banks, and so you have to get your fly within inches of the bank to make the fish want to eat your fly. So they're not typically not going to move a long ways to eat a fly, so you really have to put the fly close to them. So if there's no other structure, no obvious structure, if I'm fishing a river and I'm floating or wading, and like I said, there's not a rock or a log that I'm casting to, I'm trying to get that fly as close as I possibly can to the bank. So we're talking a game of inches. Now that is during the warmer months. During the winter months, it's a little bit different. You're fishing a lot deeper, and you're fishing a lot of times in the middle of the river, but that's a whole nother video. So we'll talk about that at some other time. All right. So speaking of other videos, if you really want to do a deep dive into this bass fishing stuff, I've actually made a fly fishing for bass course. It's online. I will throw a link to that in the description. It's courses.alvindedeaux.com, courses.alvindedeaux.com. Link is in the description. So if you really want to do a deep dive, check that out. I think there's some really helpful information in there for even somebody who's been fly fishing for a while, but definitely if you're new and trying to get your bass game up to snuff, check out the course. All right, moving along. Number 4. So once you make that cast, what do you do? and what I always say is bass don't care about your drag-free drift. And that's a common misconception, especially if you're fishing in current for bass, because we do fish for bass in current at times. But they really don't care about the drag-free drift. They want to see that fly moving. So as soon as your fly hits the water, you want to immediately get all the slack out and be ready for a strike. A lot of times they'll hit the fly before you start to move it. But if that doesn't happen, then you want to get that fly moving. So whether you're stripping and making a popper pop along the surface, or you're stripping and getting a streamer moving, you really want to get the fly moving. The bass are predators. They're not sitting there waiting for something dead to go drifting by or something helpless to go drifting by. They're usually on the lookout, on the hunt, waiting for something to get too close for comfort, and they charge out and attack. So they really want that bait fish, that frog, whatever you're throwing, they really want to see it moving. They want it to be alive. They want it to look like something that's scared or something that's trying to find a place to hide. You really want to try to, get that predatory strike. So forget about the drag free drift. Now, somebody in the comments probably going to say, well, I've caught him on a drift. And that is true. Sometimes you will catch bass on a drag free drift. There are certain circumstances where just about anything will work, but most of the time you want to get that fly moving. Those bass want to see that bait trying to get away from them, trying to escape, looking for a place to hide. So no drag free drift. Get the fly moving, get the line tight, and hang on. Okay, tip number 5. And this is one that throws a lot of trout anglers off, and it's the fact that we're not looking for current to hold trout, to hold bass. So you're used to catching trout in moving water, in nice current, riffles, drop-offs, this kind of stuff. And depending on where you're fishing, you may find bass in similar water. Our Guadalupe bass like moving water. But the thing is, they don't like water as fast as a trout. So I've never caught bass in the fast, well, I won't say never. Like I said, there's always an exception. There's always something that will surprise you. But for the most part, you're going to catch the bass in the slower water, especially if you're fishing someplace where it's predominantly largemouth bass. In our local rivers, a lot of times we'll know what we caught before we see it, depending on where we catch it. If it's slow moving water in the river, almost certainly it's a largemouth bass. If there's a little bit of current or moderately fast current, most likely a Guadalupe bass. But typically, they're not going to be in the fast water that you catch trout in. So don't waste your time making a lot of casts in really fast water, maybe find some water, some current that's got some structure, something to break the current up. And that's where you're more likely to find the bass. And if you're fishing for bass in still water, obviously there's no current, you're looking for structure. So if there's one pretty hard and fast rule that's going to work most of the time, it's look for the structure if you're looking for bass. All right, cool. Hopefully that helps some of y'all out there. If you want some more detailed bass info, check out the course. And if you want to watch another video, check out this one right here.